Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by developing yourself, developing your skills, your habits, your network, and more. Today, it's Peter and I again back for our monthly conversation. Today, we're kind of just shooting the bull around a few topics that are interesting to us, and we're trying to relate them back to our audience, those of you who are learning to code. But please let us know, are you interested in Peter and I doing more structured episodes? For example, maybe answering a question of what's the best way to land your first job, or answering a series of questions. If so, shoot me an email, aaron@parsity.io. We really enjoy, Peter and I, that is, doing these episodes where we just kind of get together and talk about the things that we're learning and trying to relate it back to our audience. Today, we're talking a lot about what I referred to in the last episode as the underemployed and what it means for this group of individuals to learn skills that eventually make them money, that eventually enable them to trade time for money. And we talk more specifically about this sort of aha moment, this process, this transformation that some of us have gone through, which is a new way to think about your career and even the way to think about how you quote, climb the ladder. Both Peter and I have sort of hit eject on that process of climbing the ladder. So we want to talk about what that looks like for you all, and how, regardless, for a lot of people, especially if you're wanting to get into tech, being here where you're at right now, learning to code and becoming a software engineer is still a great first step. Anyway, listen to this episode. I hope you enjoy. Would love your feedback, so please email me. Thanks. All right, Peter, we haven't done one of these in a while. I first want to start off with maybe, so you talked about maybe one of the topics we should have is accountability. And here I am asking you about your, what'd you call it? AAA, like automation agent, which, by the way, before we get into that, you said something, we were listing off the topics we want to talk about today. And you said, I'm not sure how relevant they are for our audience. And most of them are about business building in some ways, but I do think they are relevant for our audience. And I think I said this in this last week's episode of the podcast, where I was talking about, I think, like the natural progression of, like, if you start with where our audience is and you keep going, you'll either end up at this point where you're a very senior level engineer, maybe a manager, and you're getting paid well, but you're still trading your hours for dollars, right? Or you'll start making other decisions. And I'd say, like, you're a good example of somebody who sort of probably stopped before you hit, like, the ceiling, engineering ceiling. And I say stopped, like you didn't stop, but you started making different decisions before you were, making $800,000 at Microsoft, working 60 hours a week, right? Like, you didn't do that.
Right.
So that's why I just want to say in the beginning that I think now we have the freedom to talk about whatever we want to, because I do think the insight I want to add to our audience is eventually, like, you'll probably, if you're like Peter and I, eventually you'll get to where you want to go. And then you'll realize that you've actually got freedom to make more decisions, and build your career in a different way. You don't have to just keep climbing the engineering ladder, right? I think that's kind of like more or less where we're at, even though I'd say neither of us, especially myself, never climbed the engineering ladder. We kind of had, and that's sort of what I wanted to get at in my episode was, I think both you and I had these sort of aha moments that started making us realize that, hey, there are other options besides just, like, working a W-2 9-to-5 for forever. Now, we might go in and out of that, right? Like, you might go back to one for a little bit and come out and all that. But anyway, that being said, I want to start by keeping you accountable and asking you about we can come back to this kind of stuff, but your automation, what's the other A? Automation agency? What's the other A?
AI is supposed to be the first.
Oh, yeah, AI. I missed the buzzword.
Yeah, exactly. So Not a ton to update on, unfortunately. So the context there is I was working with my in-laws this summer. They run a summer camp. And that's where a lot of my, like if I were to write a testimonial, for example, or give a bunch of examples of what you could do, a lot of that I did this summer. So that in some way was moving the ball forward. But if for anyone that's ever worked at a summer camp, you know that it's very all consuming. And so it was tough to get the space to like really make any progress on that. But I think I like for sure I'm going to pursue that. I think part of it is going to be picking a niche. I could do like outdoor recreation businesses because I already have like experience in that. But I think if you're just saying like I'll do Zapier integrations for you, it's a little bit too broad. So you need to be able to figure out who your customer is. But yeah, I mean, I started writing on LinkedIn. We talked about that before. That was pretty good, even though I was kind of encountering the same problem that you did, where like a lot of people who were following me were not business owners; they were other engineers, and so that's a little bit hit or miss. But it was a fun thing to do, and I'm going to get back to that soon. Some of my in-laws, or not in-laws, my extended family saw it and were like concerned that I was like I guess sounding a little bit extreme about like how everyone needs to like bring automation into their lives. But I don't know. A lot of it is like modeled after these like Justin Welsh templates that we've talked about, which are emotion based. So I think they can come off a little bit that way. All to say, like, I think kind of the test of a business is like, do you have customers? So when I get my first customer, at that point, I'll feel like this is legit. Until then, it's mostly talk, which is never where I want to be, but unfortunately, it's where I end up being a lot of the time. So we'll see, but it's definitely something that's still, I think, super relevant and something that's on my plate.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I'd say like sort of freed up. We talked about it a few times our virtual assistant or my virtual assistant business I have with a friend. We haven't really honestly touched it in a few months. And I've said this before that I'm kind of in this season where I'm trying to kind of regroup with my family. And then I think in January, I'll start going back to grinding on that and trying to grow it. We have a couple of customers. They pay us every month and they're super happy, which is super cool. But whenever we first started, we felt like it's like you feel like an idiot right up until you get someone to pay you. And then you're like, suddenly that flip switches and you go from, this is so dumb, this will never work, to, oh man, I'm going to be a gazillionaire. You know, it's like the mindset is absolute 180. And so, yeah, I mean, I get that. That makes sense. And then I think also, like, as you're saying, there are seasons for this. So hopefully you did technically all the things you need to do to make sure that you could actually build automations for other people. That's cool. All right. Yeah. I won't chastise you at all about your progress, because it sounds like you still feel good about that as a business and you're going to still keep to it. So we'll keep checking in now that you're back in your main home, not at a summer camp. Talk to me about this accountability piece as it relates to, I'm sure what you're talking about is probably the accountability of not having a boss, though now you have the accountability of what if you're self-employed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we have kind of this idea we were talking a little bit about before we started recording that like freedom equals no accountability. I think that's just number one, very hard to find. And number two, like maybe not something that is desirable actually. So just practically speaking, I think unless you are investing and you're investing your own money, then you are accountable to someone. So if you're an employee, you have a manager, you're accountable to them. If you have a business that has customers, you're accountable to your customers. And so I think it's basically something that you can't really get away from. Even like you think like, oh, Warren Buffett, he's an investor. It's like, yes, but he has a publicly traded company, so he's accountable to his stockholders. So there's always there's always someone, I think, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. And so if it's a part of life that you can't get away from, I think logically the only thing to do is to embrace it. And so I think for people out there, like a lot of people, the dream is, oh, not having a boss. It's like, yeah, I mean, maybe, but, um, you'll be accountable to someone. And, if you have a family, you're accountable to them. The alternative would be you have no family. So I think like it's just worth thinking about what is a reasonable and healthy definition of freedom, and how do we kind of embrace the parts of life that might actually be good for us. It's like a random thought, but something I've been thinking about a little bit.
Yeah, no, I definitely relate to that. And I think if I think back to seasons where I've been a W 2 employee and then seasons where I've been, an entrepreneur, and maybe even you could think about successful seasons in each, they both come with like their pros and cons, right? Like I remember the greatest feeling I've had about entrepreneurship is the ambiguity of it is something that always sucks, which is you don't have a boss telling you whether you're doing well or not, right? I mean, and as always in anything, like the wins hurt far worse, or sorry, the losses hurt far worse than the wins feel good. And so I think that piece is always difficult to where whenever you have a W-2 job, it's if as the employee, like especially as a developer, for example, like you're accountable to the code you write. You're not accountable necessarily to the profitability of the business. So you sort of take orders and build the features they told you that you should build. But then you get to go home and say, if my boss said I did a good job building the features, then I don't really need to worry about the performance of the business. Now, ultimately, it will impact you, obviously, but that's not, what you're supposed to be worried about. And then your boss can tell you, you did a great job. We're going to keep paying you. We're going to pay you more. You go home and relax. In a business, you can feel like you killed it in performing your role or whatever it was that you had on your plate that week, and things could still go wrong, and and then like even whenever things go well, there's always then the next milestone, and that goalpost moves. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you that that's like an important point to keep in mind for I think folks that are in seasons of being an employee. And I think also one thing I noted in my last podcast that I posted on was this idea that if you've been laid off, you should consider actually doing what you've done, which is consult. And I know you weren't laid off; you voluntarily quit before all this happens. But I do think there's something really interesting, by the way, in like your story and in all this, because like had you kept working and then gotten laid off, right? Like kept working your full-time job, and which is a possibility. A lot of people are, I don't know about the company you're at if they had layoffs or not, but like, wouldn't you be in such a different situation than if you had voluntarily quit much earlier and then taken some contract work?
Yeah, I think probably more mentally than anything, which I think is what you're getting at. It's like the
Yeah.
situation is objectively the same, but your framing of it is completely different. Like, for example, let's say like, so I quit my job February 2022. Let's say like I had kept the job through to when the big tech layoffs were in November and gotten laid off then. Like I would have probably made the same amount of money as when I like quit and started freelancing. But yeah, it's just a mental shift of like kind of freelancing is like I'm taking it into my own hands. Whereas I think you made a great point, by the way. Like that whole section of the podcast, I think was like, I hope people didn't miss that because that was a great point, I think. But yeah, like when you are changing the framing, you're taking it into your own hands. And to your point, like you're not asking a company to pay you a salary indefinitely, which is a huge commitment. You're giving them more flexibility in it, and you also get more flexibility. So, yeah, I guess the point is like similar situation, but you're the way you're approaching it mostly mentally is different.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Let's move on to, I think we were talking, what was on your list next?
Going in order, I had hobbies. I had we talked about LinkedIn. I had entrepreneurship by acquisition, and I had Florida Gators.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Um, Let's talk about entrepreneurship by acquisition because I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. You'd mentioned that a while back you were trying to buy a business.
Yeah, I've had people have probably heard like the gamut if they've listened long enough. But something when I first quit my job that I just yesterday started to come back around to after talking to one of our neighbors was the way that a lot of people try to approach this, like being self employed, is by buying a business rather than starting one from scratch. And we've had a few people on the podcast who have done this. I'm thinking mostly of Jake Gaba, who has this game server hosting company called Indifferent Broccoli. Uh, I would encourage people to go back to listen to that episode because it was super interesting. He bought this business. It wasn't called the same name then, but it was specific to one game, hosting servers for 7 Days to Die. And then he bought it, changed the name, and expanded to a bunch of different games. And a bunch of people have done this. So, like, I really like this guy named Ryan Culp. He has this company called Fork Equity where they basically buy SaaS companies. They started with a Shopify app and sometimes like change the branding, sometimes add a bunch of features, but basically buy stuff where they think they can pull certain levers to be able to increase profit pretty immediately, and then arrange some kind of financing if it's really expensive to like maybe do seller financing where they pay the seller back over a period of time, something like that. So I really like the idea. I never pulled the trigger for a few different reasons. One was uh, just like was a big chunk to bite off, I think, right after quitting my job. And
Yeah.
secondly, like when I was talking with my neighbor, kind of came to the conclusion that that's the kind of thing that might be better with a partner. It's like a little bit of an intimidating thing to do on your own, especially if you're spending 10, 20, $30,000 at minimum. So I don't really have any conclusions, but every time I hear about somebody doing it, I'm like, why didn't I think of that? And so it just seems like maybe the deals are out there if you're willing to look hard enough, but that is almost kind of a full-time job in and of itself. So what do you
Like
think about it?
finding a deal.
Yeah, finding the right deal, I think, could be massively time consuming.
100%. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this actually. So, my good friend Scott, who he's been a guest of the podcast, by the way, he co founded Freed Up with me. He has been on this mission. Basically, he's been doing this full time, looking at deals to buy a business because he had a unique situation where he was working with an organization as like he's basically worked at a real estate company where he got a he got in on the ground floor of a lot of like real estate deals. Coming right out of ministry, he was like a student pastor, and then he got hired by one of his kids' dads to be basically their chaplain. That ended up doing all these investments, and so
Wow.
he made a good bit of I think capital from that. But as he's been telling me, and I'm going to ask for forgiveness, not permission, and sharing all this, but he describes himself as being like wealthy but cash flow poor. And so
Yeah.
he's just like, hey, I haven't had a job in, however long. It's been a long time since he's had an actual job or has had like cash flow, like a steady income. And so even part of us like kind of putting pause on Freed Up was, all right, man, you've got to figure out a way to like actually get steady income because yeah, hopefully like if your investments hit that you have, 10 years from now, you'll have way more money than I do. But right now you got to pay your mortgage and buy food, so your
Right.
money's going to run out. And so he actually did. Have you heard of Cody Sanchez?
Yes. So I was actually talking about her with this neighbor yesterday because he wants to buy a laundromat because he
Okay.
just
I
found
was
her stuff.
that like that, those light bulbs went out off whenever he said that he wants to buy a laundromat. Cause I was like, oh, this is probably Cody Sanchez. So she
Yeah.
lives in Austin. And my friend Scott, he paid like $10,000 or whatever it is to be part of her mastermind where he is like he goes to these events and like hangs out with her and people and they just like walk through like all this stuff on how to look for deals, how to like they have like templates for LOIs, letters of intent and all this, and he's just been like dishing out LOIs left and right trying to buy something. And it's interesting. It's like what I've learned just from him is that unless you can come to the table with, because I think he's looking to make 200 plus thousand a year as like a salary, which
Yeah.
means he's got to come to the table with like over $1 million. And, this isn't all, there's different financing opportunities, right? There's SBA loans, he can raise investments from other investors. But at the end of the day, it's like he has to either hire an operator, which is crazy expensive, or be able to operate it himself. I do think that world, like the Cody Sanchez world, and by the way, just for context for listeners, she's like this influencer on Twitter who talks about buying businesses. And she talks about specifically buying boring businesses like laundromats, car washes, auto mechanic shops, where you can basically have many and then cash flow from them. And you can actually take a loan, and you can, an SBA loan, so the Small Business Association government loan, is such that you can get a loan based on the assets and revenue of the business. So unlike like a home loan where you have to take out a loan against like your own income, you get to take out a loan against the asset itself, which is pretty interesting, right? So it's insane. And she talks about it as if it's this amazing, awesome thing. I think what I'm realizing though is like there's no silver bullet. Like, yeah, you have to search for forever to find a really good deal. And then if you find one, like you have to pay a lot of money to get one that's cash flowing pretty well. So I think you're right. I think the magic sauce with all of these is, can you find one that you can immediately improve, right? So either by, and I think honestly, the avenues for this are obviously increasing revenue or reducing expenses. And I think on the increasing revenue side, I don't know how much, like with digital businesses, like the ones you're talking about with previous podcast guests that we've had, Jake Gaba and those kind of folks, that seems harder to me because there's not a lot of optimization you can do if they're digital, because a lot of the optimization that happens with some of these boring businesses is, and Cody Sanchez talks about this, like she looks for a fax machine in the business. Like, does this business work right now as is profitable, even though that you can't find them on Google and you can't get in touch with them, you can't book online, any of those kinds of things? If that's the case, then like, enter Peter, automations, and internet. And now you can find me on the internet. Now you can book without having a customer service person. Now you can hire, customer support offshore and all that. It's like you've increased revenue and / expenses without really having to do much. That's amazing. But I think that's been the challenge for Scott is like, where's the business opportunity where you can like actually optimize that, and if it's not your own skills, then it needs to be like one of these kinds of things. So anywho, I'm happy to connect you with Scott. He'd be happy to share all the things he's learning. But most of his experience so far has been around, the quote, boring mom and pop businesses.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say 10K is a lot for somebody who's cash poor, but sounds like he's intent on doing it. So that's cool. Yeah, I would love to talk to him despite I feel like we talk about him a lot, but I've never actually spoke with him like one-on-one. So probably be good to do that eventually.
Like, quick thought on all of that though. I feel like I've had a few, let's be honest, you and I talk about businesses all the time. That's what we talk about when we come together. We talk about coding as like a great avenue to get to the place where you can create some freedom in your life so that you can then think about, well, what's the next step, right? And it's amazing. And honestly, I tried noting this in my last podcast, but I've seen a lot of these posts online where people talk about like, how do you start off with like no marketable skills, no money, no degree, and get to a point where you've got, some leverage in terms of money in the bank so that you are freed up to think about starting your own company and all that. And like the number one thing you start with is trading your time for skills, right? I mean, that's literally where we're at right now with our audience, is like we're asking people to trade their time for skills so that then later they could trade their skills for money at a higher rate than they can now. So that, and that's like the crazy part about this is like your time literally is the same as everyone else's, but leverage is where you're able to then make, obviously more money from that. But anyways, then we'll come back to leverage, I think. But a couple of quick things I've been noticing recently. Like, it was trendy for a while, and I totally bought into this, to think about multiple streams of revenue, right? I mean, that's like Justin Welsh. That was even his tagline for a long time. It's like building multiple streams of revenue. And I think I made a joke one time on LinkedIn that was like, I don't want to learn how to make multiple streams of revenue from anyone who's making multiple streams of revenue by teaching about making multiple streams of revenue.
Yeah.
There's all these people who say that, and it's like this idea, like, if I do more things, if I diversify, like, that's better, right? And I think what I've come to realize is, like, it's really not. Like, focusing on one thing where you can put all of your energy on one thing, although it's scary, like, you've got to, like, go all in on something. It's scary, but it's the only way, right? You can't just have diligence in one area. Like, you have to have intensity as well. And honestly, this comes back to our audience, because I find myself oftentimes counseling people who are underemployed, whether it be friends, acquaintances, or even people interested in the Parsity, and they're often looking for, like, what's the right career move, right? And it's the same question of, like, how do I invest my time and get a good return, but have a high return with low risk? And the truth is, whether you're investing your money into an investment, like buying a business, or you're investing your time in starting a business, or you're investing your time to learn a skill in hopes of getting a job, they're all the same equation, right? And if, like, if you say, okay, cool, I'm going to figure out, like, what my next gig is. I need a career change. I can't seem to land a job above $20 an hour at Target, which I've been there, except for it was $9 back then, thanks to inflation. Then it's like, you have some options. You could go do the data science course, the JavaScript course, the copywriting course, the digital marketing course, and, like, try and learn all of them. Or you can just say, okay, none of these may be the answer, but you kind of have to, like, have a little bit of a methodology for choosing one, like, and going all in. And that's really what bootcamp students do, is, like, they're saying, okay, I'm going to be a software engineer. I don't know all the answers behind, like, how I'm going to get there, or if this is the best thing, or I don't know, like, what the job is, or if there will be a job, or how hard that will be to get. But it's like, unless you go all in, like, you really can't get there, And I'm just now experiencing, like, that's the same thing with all this other stuff. I can't start 5 different businesses, expect them all to do well. Like, it's not a numbers game. Like, just like we talk about all the time with job applications and all that, it's an intensity game, I don't know. Anyway, that's a lot of blabbing, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting
as
thought.
Someone who's been in this boat also, I think, right?
Mine came more from like Daniel Vassallo. He was big on that when I was, like, following him a little bit more heavily. I think there's small bets. There's an appeal to it from, like, his whole perspective was, how do you not go back to having a full-time job? And so it was kind of like a risk aversion strategy, as opposed to what I think you're talking about, which is, like, how do you be really successful at something? And it kind of reminded me of, there's this Warren Buffett quote, which is, he says, diversification is for idiots, which is basically to say, I think, like, for the average person, if you're investing, you should diversify, because you probably don't know what you're doing. Whereas if you have some kind of an edge, like, for them, they place big bets, but it's because they have some kind of confidence in that position due to, like, knowing intimately about a business or something like that. And so I think it all kind of comes down to conviction. If you have high conviction on something, then you should probably, as Sean Purry would say, take massive action and really go all in. Whereas if you don't have that, then, I don't know, to make it pertain to our audience, you and I have both done that. Like you said, like, at a certain point, it was like, I will be a software engineer. I'm going all in on this. I'm taking a loan to go to this boot camp and I don't know what's going to happen, but there's a high level of conviction there. So that's kind of the way I think about those types of things.
Totally. Yeah. And I think, because I've heard people say this a lot, that you will, and this is again, probably the analogies are good, but I think mainly what I'm thinking about are like podcasts, probably that you and I have listened to about entrepreneurship and businesses, where you hear comments like there are individuals who seem less smart, they have it less together, they're a little bit cuckoo, but somehow they still make it work. Like somehow they still build businesses and make lots of money. And I think that comes back to this idea that, yeah, that like anything you do, if you don't quit, if you stick to it, like if it's somewhat like an obvious or logical thing, it'll probably work, right? Like I think about that, with your automation agency. Like if you keep at it and if you put enough intensity onto it, like it's gonna work, right? I mean, obviously it probably won't work in the way that you're thinking about it right now, but there's probably some things you'll have to solve, but you won't know how to solve those things until you put the right amount of intensity on it to learn and make mistakes and then like come back and regroup based on those mistakes. But if you never let yourself make those mistakes because you're scared of, you're scared of having conviction about something, then you'll never get there. And I feel like I've done this so many times before, like in my own career, where maybe I've started off, and I'm trying to give a good example of this, but I really can't, but I've started off the same level of someone else. And I saw them start something and I thought to myself, oh, there's no way that will ever work. Right. And I'm going to keep on going over here and I'm going to keep on figuring out, like thinking about it more and planning and all that. Meanwhile, they're just grinding on the one thing. And then pretty soon I feel like I've found like the right answer finally. And I look over and they're like 10 steps ahead, only because they didn't dilly dally or question themselves. They just kept going, And actually, I think a good example of that to maybe be vulnerable. And I haven't, like, to be honest, I haven't compared myself to these guys or not. But Darren McKee and Eric McKee. Darren's huge on LinkedIn. He has like over 100,000 followers now. But I met him because he was actually at my church for a while in North Carolina, in Durham. But he did some kind of like insurance sales. And when we had Project Shift, he tried selling us like an insurance plan, and the numbers just never worked. And maybe this is a little bit of a confession, but I was like, oh man, like that's okay, cool. Like you're trying to sell me some insurance stuff. And he always posted on LinkedIn. Like I always saw him posting like every day, and it was like just the most random thing he would post about. And then eventually his post just got better and better and better and better and better. And he sort of carved a niche, and he ended up like, he stuck with sales, and I don't think he even went to college. I think he started as like, he in his posts he has about this are great. Anyways, him and his brother now have this small company called SaaS Bros. And they basically do what we do, but for sales folks, like software sales folks. And it's incredible. But like the secret that he had was he just kept going. I think even his profile was like, I think for over 1,000 days he posted on LinkedIn and like just didn't stop it. And eventually like something hit, but like that you can tell has been the mindset he's had in his career too, anyways, yeah. That's just another soapbox, but I think that's what I've been convicted by recently is like, okay, I probably need to go all in on one thing and stick with that one thing. Right. That's right. Where stuff happens. And even listening to, you and I talk about My First Million a lot. There's this guy on there, Andrew Wilkinson, who started this. I think we probably talked about it before, Teeny, which is this, basically the ideal like hold company, right? He's bought tons of companies, including Dribble. He owns Dribble. He owns AeroPress, like freaking AeroPress. I love AeroPress.
Yeah.
But they recently IPO'd, and I don't remember the numbers, but like their finances came out and it was like 90% of the value of the company. Probably, maybe it wasn't that much, but it was a huge chunk of the value of that hold company that had, a dozen plus different businesses they had bought over many years most of it came from the first thing he started, which was a design agency.
Right.
Meta Labs.
Not the sexiest thing.
No, just he did the one thing. He made an agency that designed great stuff, and he got really freaking good at designing stuff. And it's like, okay, so he asked, what's this guy's like X factor and his secret? It was starting this great design company. Like he could have had done none of the other hold company, investing, like all that, even though those titles are way sexier. He could have done none of those things and just been the leader of this design company and would still have 90% of his wealth, you know? Yeah. Anyways, so go all in.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah. We're pivoting back to focus.
Back to focus. Yeah. Okay. What else we got?
Left on my list, Florida Gators, new hobbies, and then I know you got a bunch of stuff, so happy to do whatever.
No, I kind of went through most of my stuff. I think I'll tie my stuff in a bow real quick because I think that was all that, which is just this encouragement, I think, to people that are in this underemployed position, that I think everyone wants the safe option, because especially if you get laid off, or if you're having a hard time finding work, it feels like you need to run to safety, right? Like your logical brain starts kicking in. You're like, oh, I got to go get a steady job right now. And probably you should like get some income quickly, if you can, so you can pay your bills and all that. I'm not giving any financial advice here, but I do think like these principles don't change, right? Where it's like, that might mean, and I told a person recently I talked to, I was like, look, if you want to become a software engineer, like go for it. You might be 9, 12, 18 months out though, from like landing that first job. So just want to let you know that like, this is a long-term commitment, but like, you can do it. You just have to like make the commitment. And so I think maybe that's the takeaway I want for our audience is like, this is a grind and it's hard work, but if you start now, you know, like you'll get there for sure. Okay. Ties up my stuff. Florida Gators. Let's talk about them Gators. Tim Tebow, praise the Lord.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So this is awesome. So probably the audience has seen at least one of these, but Netflix has this series called Untold, and it's basically sports documentaries. It's kind of now just occurring to me, it's like a ripoff a little bit of like 30 for 30 from ESPN. But I think this is the second or third season. I think third season. So the first season had like Marty Fish, who was a tennis player and like suffered from anxiety. So it told that story. It's told stories about like the Malice in the Palace, the brawl between the Pacers and Pistons, which was amazing. And so it's all these like stories where either you don't know the backstory or it's stuff you've never heard of. So this season they had like Jake Paul, for example, who's like really trying to make it as like a legit boxer. They had Johnny Manziel, who was like basically maybe the biggest draft bust of all time. Yeah. Johnny Football. And they also had a 4-part series, which is super out of the ordinary. Usually they're just like 1 or 2, but a 4-part series on the kind of golden era, basically, of Florida Gators football when Tim Tebow was there, from 06 to 09, or maybe 2010, where they won 2 national championships out of 4 years, basically, or 3 years. So they won 06 and 08. And just like incredible story, like everything you would want in a story in general, like the characters, the like high pressure situations, the like triumphs, the disappointments, like so many things. But a few things stood out to me because we always say at the beginning of the podcast, like part of this is developing your mindset, in addition to like your skills, your network, etc. And so many like mindset things stood out to me. So like, first of all, like they hire Urban Meyer, who basically they had like this coach, Steve Spurrier, for 11 years, who was like very good, was a quarterback at the school, had won a national championship with them in the 60s. And then he leaves. They have a few years where they're not very good. They hire Urban Meyer, who is completely untested, basically. And he comes in and he basically decides to make it the hardest college sports program in the country. So basically, like a little bit Moneyball like, where it's like we're kind of whipping it into shape.
Nice.
Basically, that's like the first episode is like just how hard he made it. And so I think there's a lesson on there on basically what he was looking for was buy-in. And so he was trying to weed out people that weren't completely bought in and weren't willing to work as hard as they possibly could. And that was his first season was in '05, I think. And so the first year they were like pretty good. The next season they won the national championship, but I thought it was interesting how it kind of starts with kind of like we were talking about, like being all in, being committed. And so I thought that was an interesting lesson. I think there are a lot of interesting lessons about determination. So for example, in '08, they were trying to go undefeated and win the national championship, but they lost to Ole Miss. And that was kind of where Tebow gives this very famous speech. I was in high school at the time, so I remember it pretty well, where he basically says,
Nice.
like, no one's going to work harder than I will the rest of the season. No one's going to push the team harder than I will the rest of the season. And they ended up winning the national championship. And so I think there's a lot of lessons there just watching him and like his arc in the story about determination and kind of like just setting your mind to something and giving 100% effort. Just really impressed with him in general from that perspective, and leadership. Like obviously we're all around other people at varying times. And I thought it was super interesting. Like basically they went to see him play high school football and they decided like, we've got to have this guy, partly because he fit into their offense. So they were running this like spread offense where they needed a quarterback that could run and they didn't really have that. But also like his energy level, it's like all over the documentary. It's just like super inspiring where he just like, he's fired up, he's firing people up. And he basically came in as a freshman and set the bar like extremely high for what the work ethic was going to be. And also like, it was pretty well publicized, but he's a Christian. He didn't do much partying and et cetera, et cetera. So he was like very much set apart on like every level from the rest of the team and like kind of raised the tide for everybody. And so I thought there were a lot of like really interesting like leadership considerations just watching him. So anyway, all around amazing story. Like I think the way they did it was awesome. And if you look for it, I think there's a lot of lessons like as it pertains to just mindset and your approach to things.
Do you feel like, first of all, I love that. And I watched probably some, I haven't watched this, but did you watch Welcome to Wrexham?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. All right. It sounds kind of similar. Where you turn a team around kind of thing. Um, Man, those, do you feel like, I don't know what the question is, but it's around like, I feel like there are seasons where you have to work hard towards a singular goal, right? Like if we're being real practical, right? Tim Tebow, I don't know how old he was, 18, 19 years old, prime of his life, probably has basically, he's got to go to some classes, but other than that, has nothing to do but be a boss at football, right? And probably like from then on throughout his pro career, that was like literally what he was in charge of doing. Do you think there are like that's a mindset you can stay in like for a long haul, or do you think there's like seasons for that? I mean, I guess even in football, there's literal seasons where you have an off season. And I've been thinking about that recently because I just feel like I'm in a season where I'm in an off season right now. You know, do you feel like your body and your mind go through that where there's like a season for like I'm going to push hard, or do you feel like you're supposed to be in that zone all the time?
Yeah, it's so hard to answer because I think part of it comes down to the person. Like I know for me, I value kind of seasonality in work where it's like you have an intense time, but then you get to rest, kind of like, sprint and rest as opposed to like just doing the same thing all the time. Um, as it pertains to like people that can do that all the time, I think they're just built differently. Like that was one thing that was clear watching the documentary is this guy is just like on a different level. And I don't know where that comes from. I think it's kind of like just part of who he is. Like it was
Yeah.
interesting seeing the connection between him and Urban Meyer. Like in the episode I just watched, I think this is a little bit unhealthy, but it kind of gives you a window into the perspective. Like they win their second national championship and the guys are celebrating in the locker room, and Urban Meyer said he went into the other room and was like texting recruits. It's like already thinking about the next year. And so I think you got to be able to enjoy your success at minimum, but there are some people that just like love the grind. I'm not one of them,
Yeah.
but like I think when you look at people who have accomplished amazing things, like for example, I really like this podcast Founders. There's another similar one called How to Take Over the World. Like all these people on these podcasts, like Steve Jobs, Napoleon, just like massively, massively energetic people that could just go after something with a ton of determination and basically no rest. And so I think it's probably necessary for doing amazing things, but I don't necessarily want to change the world. I just want to like
Yeah.
do well at what I'm doing. And I just know I couldn't live a life with no rest. What do you think?
No, I think you're right. I also think there's part of me that feels like there are experiences that I've only tasted or maybe have never had. So, like when you mentioned all those examples of people who, that feeling, I don't know who Urban Meyer is. I don't know anything about football, but I can imagine, I have like the picture in my mind of someone who is grinding day in and day out, and the grinding's effective, right? Like whenever he pushes the pedal, it moves, right? Like they're winning national championships. And so probably for in that moment, like the end goal isn't necessarily to get to that point and party after the national championship. And in fact, most people I feel like I've talked to who have had some kind of like massive success, right? That explain that the actual like culmination of it is fairly fleeting. I was talking to a guy recently who has like an insane amount of wealth. And I was sort of asking him like, sort of like his advice as an older, wealthier person, like how he thinks about ambition, like grinding the next thing. And I think one of the things he told me was he'll never forget he closed some massive deal and made some massive amount of money, and he got in his and he was excited, and he like probably popped some champagne or something at his office, and then he got in the car to drive home, and he just felt empty because it was like, is that it? Like, is this literally the thing we've been working for forever?
Yeah.
And I think it comes back to like that experience of working hard with the team together with other people, and then like having a place where you're adding value, and like the hard work that you're putting in is actually making changes. Like I think that's the thing that we chase, more often than not. Like not necessarily the result. We might think we want the results, but I think the thing we actually want is probably more of like that journey process of, and that's why like someone like Urban Meyer is like, all right, cool. This is going to help me continue to stay on this journey. Like this is where I want to be, kind of thing. And I think that's why some people get addicted to work. And a lot of us out here are looking like, how do you ever get addicted to work? And it might be because, many of us have rarely felt the feeling of effective work. We're actually able to do the thing that produces results. And it's not that you want the results, but the process of being able to have agency in that is fun in of itself. And I think where seasonality comes into play is when you start to destroy other season parts of your life, right? Like if you're working so hard that it's at the expense of other parts of your life, then obviously you can't do that for indefinitely. You have to have seasons. And then I think also if you're doing work and you're grinding and you're not getting the results, that's obviously also going to burn you out. And so you got to take breaks and come back. I remember there's a podcast episode where I interviewed Brian Dayton, who is my old boss. I think I probably brought this up a few times, where I just love the way he framed this, which was he thought of himself as an entrepreneur, but was willing to like work a W-2 job as often as needed. And so like what he would do is he would start something, quit his job, try to get it going, wouldn't work. He'd go back and be a software engineer for a while. And I think what he said in the episode was he would pad his bank account and kind of retreat, rest, get some money, and like go back at it, you know? And eventually he quit a lot of companies, but he didn't quit entrepreneurship. And eventually obviously had this massive exit and has a beautiful house in Cancun on the beach. But
Nice.
Anyway, yeah. So I love that example, man. But I'm always thinking of that, like, what is it that we're chasing? Is it like the experience of the journey? And I think it's innate in us, right? I think it's like literally made, like we talk about this sometimes, that like we were created to work. I think that's what we connect with, is like the work itself more often than like, you know, the stuff. But should we segue to leverage real quick?
Yep, we can do that.
I know I mentioned it, but you said something about Naval. What do you mean by wanting to go into, you said Navalisms or something like that?
Yeah, so you mentioned also Naval a little bit in passing in your leverage episode. And I thought it might be helpful for people to give like the categories briefly, because he breaks it down in kind of like almost like a framework, how to think about it. So he talks about leverage through basically three different things. The first thing is labor. So if you own a company, or like even Freed Up's a great example, you're leveraging yourself through hiring, essentially. So you have people that are doing work on your behalf that you would otherwise have to do. There's also capital, so investing. So you own whole companies or parts of companies. It's like kind of a Warren Buffett thing, whereas like those companies are kind of systems that are running, and you are essentially reaping some benefit from that. Whereas like without it, you wouldn't have ownership, and you know, you'd have to go do all this stuff yourself. It's kind of like one step removed from labor, almost, is the way I think about it. So, and then there's the last thing, tech and media is what he calls it, code and media. So the last way to leverage is through essentially a lot of the stuff that we've talked about, automations, or like a media example could be like a YouTube video. So I could explain the same concept to 50 people individually, or I can make a YouTube video about it and then just send them that. Whereas I only have to essentially say it once with the video. I have to say it a bunch of times without media. So those are different ways of thinking about how to use leverage to your advantage. And I feel like other than capital, you and I have done the majority of them. So that's just a way to think about it, and think about what category you want to invest in.
Yeah, no, I love that. And thanks for, to be honest, I had forgotten about the categories in the episode, but I mean, to tie this kind of up in a bow, which I guess I've tried to do a couple of times, I think these are all related, which is like this process, this journey of learning your first line of JavaScript, going through boot camp, getting a job as a software engineer. We're probably all on like this similar journey of like learning leverage, because it's like something you can't do overnight. Like you have to build a lever, right? You've got to like literally take time to build a lever, either by amassing wealth, learning the skills to build code, figuring out how to automate and delegate, by leading at some point. Like we're all kind of learning leverage, and hopefully our lives get, I think in some ways, more fulfilling. Even going back to the example I just gave, which was like, you know, grinding hard with a team towards a goal and your work is effective. Like the way you do that and have a family that loves you and you're present with them is like, you got to use leverage, right? Like you literally like, I mean, Peter, you have leverage, right? You got it from the skills you have. I think you saved quite a bit of money at some point, if I'm not mistaken. Like you've got, even though like you wouldn't say like, hey, I'm a big investor, massive entrepreneur, like you have a few of these leverage items like stored up for yourself, so that now you're able to live into your values, which is spending time with family and having more freedom than you had before. So I think that's a really cool way to think about like this journey, is like being part of that process. Man, there was one more thing I was going to say before we wrapped up, but it totally just escaped my mind.
No worries. I think that was pretty good. Yeah. I think, yeah, all these things are related in some way. And so, yeah, you probably start with skills and go from there.
Yeah, totally. All right. On that note, we're here to teach you skills. Hit us up if you got questions. But I think that's the podcast.
Sweet.
All right, that does it for today's episode of the Develop Yourself podcast. As always, if you want to take your first step to becoming a software engineer, check out Dev30 at zev30.xyz, or visit our website to learn more about our coding bootcamp, Parsity. It's all online, all asynchronous. You're probably going to want to do something like Dev30 in order to learn enough JavaScript to pass the admissions code challenge. But our website is parsity.io. That is parsity.io. We will see you back here next week.